What if the voice in your head isn't really yours? What if the words you use to speak to yourself have been shaped by fear, judgment, and someone else's story? Let's talk about the book that made me question all of it, and why its clarity still shakes the world. There's a moment, often in the quiet spaces between the chaos, when we hear ourselves, not the version of us that performs for the world, not the voice trained to be polite or agreeable, but the raw, unfiltered voice that lives just beneath the surface. That voice, the one we use when no one's around, is perhaps the most powerful narrative in our lives. It shapes how we see the world, how we treat ourselves, and how we experience truth. The way we speak to ourselves, our inner dialogue, has the power to lift us into transcendence or bury us under layers of shame, fear, and doubt. It determines how we interpret what we read, what we see, and what we believe. Before any book can transform us, before any truth can settle into our hearts, we have to be willing to change the way we listen, not to others, but to ourselves. When I speak to myself in love, I notice how differently I see the world. I don't need to rush to judgment. I don't need to label someone else as wrong, just to feel right. But when my inner voice is clouded with self-doubt, insecurity, or pain that hasn't been healed, I find myself suspicious of anything that challenges me. The truth feels like a threat. Wisdom sounds like an accusation, and sacred words, they become foreign, even feared. This is why the power of inner dialogue is so deeply connected to how we receive something like the Qur'an, or any profound text, really. When our self-talk is rooted in defensiveness or fear, we can't truly hear what's being said. We're too busy translating everything through our wounds, through our past, through the lies we've told ourselves about who we are and what we deserve. But when we shift that inner conversation, when we speak to ourselves with curiosity, with openness, with humility, then something extraordinary happens. We begin to hear with new ears. We begin to see with a clearer heart. We begin to feel, not just react. It's not about adopting a new religion or trying to force ourselves into a new belief system. It's about being present enough to allow sacred text to mean something to us, not because we're obligated, but because we're open, because we are choosing to speak to ourselves in a new way. I remember reading certain passages and pausing, not because I didn't understand the words, but because I realized how rarely I allowed myself to believe that divine truth could be this close, this intimate. My inner dialogue had always made the sacred feel distant, otherworldly, something belonging to scholars or saints. But when I changed how I spoke to myself, when I began to trust that I too was worthy of understanding, of insight, of divine connection, then the text began to speak back. This is why inner dialogue isn't just mental chatter, it's the soil in which revelation takes root. If your soil is full of thorns, of shame, of fear, of unworthiness, then even the most beautiful truth will struggle to grow there. But if your inner voice becomes softer, more nurturing, more honest, then even a single verse can become a forest of transformation. There are people who will never open the Qur'an, not because they're incapable, but because their inner voice has already told them it's not for them. They've been taught to fear it, to avoid it, to see it as a threat rather than a source of light. That fear didn't start with the book. It started with the voice they speak to themselves, with the one that says, don't look too close, don't question, don't challenge what you've been told. But what if your voice said something different? What if it said you are safe to explore, you are allowed to be curious, you are worthy of knowing? I want to say this clearly, you do not need permission from the world to approach sacred text. You need alignment within yourself. You need to listen to that voice inside that asks, what if there's more? That voice isn't defiant, it's divine. And when that inner voice shifts, when it becomes more truthful, more courageous, then even the things you once feared begin to look different. They begin to feel less like threats, and more like invitations. When I speak to myself with reverence, I approach all things with more reverence. The way I listen changes. The way I engage with difficult truths changes. I stop asking, what if I'm wrong? And I start asking, what can I learn? I stop fearing correction and start welcoming growth. And I begin to understand that the real battle isn't out there in the world, it's in here within the dialogue I have with my own soul. Every sacred text, including the Qur'an, speaks in a frequency that only an honest heart can truly hear, and honesty starts with the words we whisper to ourselves when no one else is listening. If you are telling yourself that you are unworthy, that you can't understand, that you should be afraid, then that voice will always drown out revelation. But if you begin to say, I am ready, I am open, I am enough, then the pages begin to unfold differently, the words begin to land softer, the truth begins to feel like home. The Qur'an, like many sacred books, does not scream at us, it waits. It waits for us to stop shouting over ourselves. It waits for us to turn inward and ask the right questions. It waits for our inner voice to become a sanctuary instead of a battlefield. And it waits for the day we decide to speak to ourselves in a way that invites wisdom, rather than resists it. The Qur'an as a mirror, not a weapon. We live in a world where books can be dangerous, not because of what's written in them, but because of what people do with them. And too often the Qur'an has been placed on a shelf, not as a source of illumination, but as an artifact of fear, misquoted, misunderstood, misused. When we look at it through the lens of violence, control or division, it becomes something people use to build walls rather than open doors. But when we look deeper, when we allow ourselves to engage with it from a place of sincerity rather than suspicion, we begin to understand that the Qur'an was never meant to be a weapon, it was meant to be a mirror, and mirrors don't lie, they reflect, not always what we want to see, but what's already there. The Qur'an at its core isn't trying to scare you, it's not trying to pull you into an ideology, it's not calling you into war, it's calling you into presence, into stillness, into remembrance. And that's why it makes people uncomfortable, because reflection requires honesty, and honesty is hard when the reflection doesn't match the image you've curated for the world. There's something deeply vulnerable about reading something that sees through you, and that's what this book does. It doesn't just meet you where you are, it holds up a mirror to who you've become, and gently asks, is this really you? Is this the life your soul agreed to before it entered the world? It doesn't do it with cruelty, it does it with precision, with grace. It speaks of mercy almost every step of the way. It reminds you that your Creator is closer to you than your own jugular vein, not to frighten you, but to remind you that you are never alone, never abandoned, never outside the reach of divine compassion. That kind of message can only feel like a threat if you're not ready to face what needs healing. When people say they fear the Qur'an, what they often mean is that they fear what it will reveal, not about the world but about themselves, because this isn't a book that lets you hide behind performance. It doesn't reward hollow piety, it's not interested in the masks you wear, it's interested in truth, in justice, in your awakening. And awakening, by its very nature, disrupts the illusions we've grown comfortable living inside. The Qur'an does not come to coerce you, it comes to clarify you. It doesn't demand that you lose yourself, it invites you to remember yourself, and not the self shaped by trauma or culture, or external expectation, but the self that knows peace, the self that understands balance, the self that is deeply, unshakably connected to something bigger. When I first sat with the Qur'an, not as a scholar, not as a critic, but as a seeker, I was startled by the depth of its compassion, the way it kept returning to justice, to kindness, to self-restraint, to humility. This wasn't a manifesto for dominance, it was a guide for living with integrity. It was the kind of book that doesn't let you walk away unchanged, not because it demands submission, but because it insists on honesty. It asks you questions you didn't know you needed to answer. What do you worship? What do you fear? What are you running from? What are you building your life upon? These aren't abstract philosophical musings, they're intimate inquiries into the architecture of your spirit. And if you're brave enough to answer, you begin to realize the power of the book lies not in how loudly it speaks, but in how deeply it sees. But to see it that way, you have to put down the lens of fear. You have to be willing to let go of what you've heard, what you've been taught by those who never read it with open hearts. You have to stop looking at it as a book of them and us. You have to come to it not as a courtroom but as a mirror. There are verses in the Qur'an that will shake you, not because they are violent, but because they are unflinchingly real. They talk about arrogance, greed, injustice, exploitation, and the delusions of power. They hold humanity accountable, and of course that's threatening to those who profit from illusion, who thrive in systems of inequality, who use religion to manipulate. But for those who long for something real, for truth that doesn't bend to trends or political convenience, the book offers clarity. It also offers paradox. It challenges without condemning. It calls out injustice while constantly extending mercy. It demands introspection, even as it offers consolation, and in that complexity lies its brilliance. It doesn't hand you easy answers, it walks with you through difficult questions. When the Qur'an is treated as a weapon, it wounds. When it's treated as a mirror, it heals. But healing is a process that not everyone is ready for. That's why the book isn't for those who want quick fixes. It's for those who are willing to be undone and remade. It's for those who understand that real transformation doesn't come through comfort, it comes through truth. And truth by its very nature doesn't flatter, it reveals. And what it reveals isn't always pretty, but it is necessary. And if you can bear the sight of your own soul, stripped of ego, free from pretense, then you'll find something in these pages that goes beyond theology. You'll find a conversation with the divine, one that doesn't shout over your doubts, but listens through them, one that doesn't punish your questions, but honors them, one that doesn't pull you into fear, but walks you through it, until fear has nothing left to say. Liberation through knowledge. There is something profoundly liberating about knowing for yourself, not being told, not being handed pre-packaged ideas about what something is or isn't, but sitting with it, touching the words, letting them live inside of you. That kind of knowing cannot be manufactured, it cannot be faked, it cannot be handed down like a family heirloom. It must be earned through your own willingness to see. And when it comes to the Qur'an, that kind of knowing changes everything. What they fear is not the book itself, it's not even the contents of the book. What they fear is what happens when someone reads it with their own eyes, listens with their own ears, and decides to understand rather than inherit prejudice. That kind of understanding can't be controlled, it can't be manipulated, it leads to questions, and questions are dangerous to those who rely on ignorance to maintain power. Knowledge, especially sacred knowledge, has always been a threat to systems built on control, because once a person knows something for themselves, once they stop outsourcing their spirituality to other people's opinions, they become impossible to contain. They don't just follow, they discern. They don't just absorb, they examine, and that's when they start to wake up. The Qur'an offers a particular kind of knowledge. It's not merely intellectual, it's spiritual. It doesn't just inform, it transforms. It rearranges the architecture of how you see the world. It doesn't ask you to memorize, it asks you to reflect. It's not about how many verses you can recite, but how deeply you've let those words live in you, how much of your ego you've been willing to confront, how many illusions you've been willing to shed. When I say that people fear the Qur'an because of the knowledge it holds, I don't mean historical facts or legal frameworks. I mean the kind of inner knowing that shakes the foundation of passivity. Because when you come face to face with the truth of something, especially something that's been misrepresented for so long, you can't go back to the old story. You can't pretend you didn't see what you saw. You can't unknow the feeling of being seen by something bigger than yourself. This is what liberation through knowledge looks like. It's not loud, it's not always dramatic, sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's the simple moment when you read a verse that speaks directly to something you've been carrying your whole life, and you realize that someone somewhere already knew your struggle, already offered you a map out of it, and that map was hidden, not because it was unavailable, but because someone told you it wasn't meant for you. So many people are kept away from sacred texts, not because the texts are too complicated, but because they've been told it's dangerous to understand for themselves. They've been told that questioning is disrespect, that exploration is rebellion, that engaging with the Qur'an, without years of formal training, is reckless. But what is truly reckless is the idea that access to God should be filtered through hierarchy, that the Creator's words are not for the creation unless intermediated by someone else's interpretation. That's not liberation, that's gatekeeping, and the Qur'an, if you read it closely, warns against that kind of spiritual elitism again and again. It does not favor the self-righteous. It does not praise those who use knowledge to elevate themselves above others. It honors those who seek sincerely, who ask with humility, who remain open even when the answers are difficult. The knowledge found in the Qur'an is not a tool for arrogance. It's a path to awakening. But awakening requires that you dismantle the layers of noise that have kept you asleep. It means confronting what you've been taught about who you are, what you're worth, and what your purpose is. And that's terrifying to people who benefit from your silence. Because once you know that you are more than a label, more than a role, more than a consumer in a broken system, then you start to act differently. You start to speak differently. You start to live differently. This is why people fear others discovering the Qur'an for themselves. Not because they think the text is dangerous, but because they know the result might be. They know what it does to someone who has only known fear and finds mercy, who has only known punishment and finds compassion, who has only known division and finds unity. That kind of shift can't be undone. And it spreads, it moves from the page into the heart, from the heart into action, from action into community. Knowledge, when it is pure and unfiltered, frees people, and that freedom threatens the narratives that have been built to keep people confused, afraid, compliant. When you know who you are, when you see yourself reflected in divine words that do not belittle you, but call you higher, you stop shrinking to fit into someone else's version of the truth. But this liberation through knowledge isn't passive. It doesn't come just by glancing at a verse or skimming through pages. It requires presence, stillness, engagement. You have to sit with it, let it unsettle you, let it raise questions you don't yet have answers to, because the Qur'an is not a book of conclusions, it's a book of beginnings. It opens doors, it doesn't close them. It's meant to draw you in, not push you away, but only if you're ready to see it for what it is, and not what others have claimed it to be. There is a reason why spiritual texts throughout history have been hidden, burned, restricted, mistranslated, because true knowledge does not simply inform, it liberates, and liberation disrupts control. It reclaims dignity, it restores the soul's authority to choose, to seek, to speak. It gives you back to yourself. And when a person has that, when they walk through the world no longer needing permission to know, to understand, to grow, there is no system, no fear, no falsehood that can hold them anymore. Why they fear its clarity. Clarity is not just about words. It is not merely the ability to read a line and understand its grammar. True clarity cuts deeper. It opens the unseen. It reveals the motive behind the action, the illusion behind the performance. It is the kind of clarity that doesn't just answer your questions, it questions your answers. And that's what makes the Qur'an so powerful, so enduring, and for many so unsettling, because it is not a book that allows you to hide behind ambiguity. It doesn't indulge in spiritual vagueness. It is clear, and clarity, for those who rely on confusion to maintain their place in the world, is terrifying. They don't fear the Qur'an because it's difficult to understand. They fear it because it's too easy to understand when read with an honest heart. That clarity is revolutionary. not in the violent sense of upheaval, but in the inner sense of liberation, because when you encounter divine clarity, your excuses start to fall apart, your distractions become obvious, your patterns of harm, of avoidance, of submission to what does not serve, get exposed. The Qur'an does not speak in riddles, designed to confuse you. It speaks with precision, with repetition, with a rhythm that insists you not just hear the truth, but face it. This kind of clarity can't be controlled. That's the real reason it's feared, not by the humble or the seeker, but by the powerful, the dishonest, and the manipulators of religion and history. It's feared because it bypasses the traditional gatekeepers, because once someone picks it up and reads it, not from a place of cynicism, but from a place of sincerity, they start to see through the noise, through the lies, through the systems built on misrepresentation. They begin to ask, why was I told this book was dangerous? Why was I told to be afraid of it? The clarity of the Qur'an is not cold or clinical. It's not sterile. It's emotional. It speaks to the human condition. It speaks of despair and hope, of loss and redemption, of justice and oppression. It gives you a clear lens through which to view the world, not through the lens of ideology or politics, but through the eyes of the soul. It says, here is truth, here is mercy, here is a path, will you walk it? And the fear of that invitation is not about what the book says, it's about what the book clarifies. It clarifies where your allegiance lies. It clarifies your character. It clarifies your silence when you should have spoken, and your arrogance when you should have listened. It clarifies how easy it is to live asleep, and how painful it is to wake up. Clarity means you are no longer innocent in your ignorance, and that's a hard truth to carry. Once you've seen, you can't unsee. Once you know, you can't pretend you don't. That's why the Qur'an is not feared for its complexity, but for its simplicity, for its insistence on remembrance, for its demand that you reflect. It becomes a mirror you reflect. It becomes a mirror not just of the self, but of the society we live in. It calls out oppression, whether political, economic, or spiritual. It defends the orphan, the poor, the outcast. It speaks again and again of justice. That is clarity in action. Not just personal transformation, but communal accountability. And there are people who don't want that kind of clarity in the hands of the masses. They want confusion, because confusion is easier to manipulate. If you keep people spiritually starved and intellectually dependent, you can control them. But if they begin to realize that the Qur'an was never meant to be locked behind languages they don't speak, or institutions they don't have access to, then the narrative begins to shift. People begin to realize that God did not hide truth in obscurity. He made it plain, made it rhythmic, made it memorable, and then he told people, think, reflect, use your reason. That's not a message that cultivates blind obedience. That's a message that builds moral courage. That's a message that scares institutions built on compliance without understanding. Because a person who thinks, who reflects, who prays with intention, cannot be reduced to a pawn. They become powerful, not because they control others, but because they are anchored. They are no longer adrift in a world that thrives on disorientation. They have a compass, a direction, a source that speaks not only to the intellect, but to the heart. The Qur'an doesn't only make things clear, it also makes clear that you have a choice, that you are responsible for what you know and how you live it. It removes the illusion that you can claim ignorance when you have been given access, and in a world where so many spiritual teachings are cloaked in secrecy or hierarchy, the clarity of the Qur'an is radically inclusive. It says this message is for you, yes you, wherever you are, however broken you feel, however distant you think you've wandered. This book sees you, and because it sees you, it demands truth from you. That's where the fear comes in, not the fear of being punished, but the fear of being seen, of being exposed, of having your motives laid bare, your intentions challenged, of realizing that your prayers were performance. your rituals routine, your knowledge superficial. The Qur'an doesn't settle for outer alignment, it wants the inner. It doesn't just ask what you do, it asks why you do it. That is clarity, not just the kind that helps you make decisions, but the kind that reshapes your understanding of life, that turns you inward, then sends you outward more rooted, more compassionate, more awake. And that clarity is the true revolution, one heart at a time, one soul at a time, until the fog lifts, and what once looked like fear begins to look like freedom. When I speak to myself this way, there is a voice inside each of us, sometimes loud, sometimes subtle, sometimes encouraging, sometimes cruel. It narrates our lives, whether we ask it to or not. It shapes the way we move through the world, the way we respond to joy, the way we manage pain, and far too often, that voice is not ours. It was given to us, inherited, conditioned, echoes of things people said to us when we were too young to know how deeply they'd settle into our bones, whispers of judgment, of fear, of not enough, and so we repeat them, to ourselves, again and again, until they sound like truth. But what if they're not? What if that inner voice is not who we really are, but who we were taught to be? When I began to sit with the words of the Qur'an, not through someone else's lens, not through the noise of headlines, but quietly, intentionally, as a woman who wanted to see for herself, I noticed something. The voice of the book and the voice in my head were speaking two different languages. One was filled with scarcity, shame, urgency, punishment. The other was filled with mercy, patience, rhythm, and a kind of dignity that called me back to myself, not to an identity constructed for approval, but to a deeper knowing, a remembering. And in that space I had to ask, why have I spent so long speaking to myself in a voice that doesn't even belong to me? This is what many don't understand about the Qur'an. It's not just a set of rules or historical stories, or poetic lines to be admired from a distance. It's a voice, a presence, a consciousness. And when you let that voice inside, when you begin to carry it with you into your conversations with yourself, you start to realize just how much you've been tolerating inner language that is unkind, that is violent, that is not rooted in truth. You start to notice how quickly you shame yourself for failing, how easily you dismiss your own beauty, how often you minimize your value before anyone else even gets the chance. And the Qur'an, it doesn't do that. It does not humiliate, it dignifies. Even when it calls you out, it does so like a mirror, not to mock but to awaken, not to destroy but to invite. And when you take that invitation seriously, when you allow its words to replace your inner dialogue, the change is not just spiritual, it's psychological, emotional, practical. Because now, when I speak to myself, I speak differently. I remind myself that my worth is not based on productivity, because the Qur'an doesn't praise people for how much they've accomplished. It honors those who are sincere, those who return, those who are grateful. I remind myself that struggling is not failing, because the book is full of people who wrestled with their faith, with their fear, with their fatigue, and still they were beloved. I remind myself that repentance is not shameful, it is honored, elevated. It is an act of courage, not weakness. This inner transformation is quiet, but it changes everything, because how you speak to yourself becomes how you live. If you speak harshly, you live defensively. If you speak gently, you live generously. If your inner voice is rooted in fear, then every choice you make carries that vibration. But if your inner voice is rooted in divine clarity and mercy, then your choices begin to align with something deeper than survival. They begin to align with trust. One of the most radical things anyone can do in today's world is to live from a place of self-compassion that is not shallow, not performative, but sacred. Not love yourself as a catchy phrase, but honor the soul that was created in divine love. That's different. That's deeper. And that's what the Qur'an teaches, if you let it speak to you directly, not through dogma, not through fear tactics, but but as a divine conversation with your most honest self. This is not about arrogance, it's not about self-worship, it's about realignment, it's about recognizing when the inner voice has been hijacked by stories that were never yours, the stories of not being enough, of being too much, of needing to earn your worth. The Qur'an dismantles those lies. It reminds you that you were created with intention, not accident, that you were fashioned in balance, that your value is not determined by the world's approval, but by the fact that God chose to breathe into you His Spirit. When I began to speak to myself this way, something changed. I stopped rushing to prove. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped demanding perfection from myself in order to feel worthy of rest, of joy, of softness, and I started to listen more to others, yes, but also to myself. I started to recognize when the old voice tried to creep in, and instead of believing it, I began to answer it, not with anger, but with scripture, with remembrance, with the kind of internal clarity that only comes from communion with something greater than ego. This is what scares some people about the Qur'an, not its politics, not its laws, not its cultural associations, but its power to change the inner landscape of a human being, to give them back their voice, to rewrite the script inside their mind. Because once you start speaking to yourself with sacred language, the language of truth and tenderness, you stop believing the lies that built entire industries that sell you insecurity, that profit off your silence, that require your self-doubt in order to function. So much of the world's dysfunction begins in how we treat ourselves. That's the root. And the Qur'an, when you sit with it, when you let it speak into the quiet places, starts healing that root. It begins with how you talk to yourself in the morning, how you respond to your own mistakes, how you hold yourself through grief, how you name your desires, and once that changes, the world around you starts to shift, not because the world got easier, but because you are no longer abandoning yourself to survive it. When I speak to myself this way, when I speak Qur'an to my fears and doubts and flaws, I don't become more rigid, I become more spacious. I don't become closed off. I open, I soften, I deepen, I remember, and in remembering who I really am, I begin to imagine a different way of being, one where mercy is not just a word I read, but a state I live in, one where power is not about dominance, but about presence, one where the voice in my head finally sounds like it's on my side, not because I forced it, but because I listened long enough to a deeper voice, the one that was always there, waiting, whispering, reminding me who I've been all along. Conclusion: what they fear is not just a book, it's a revolution of the soul. The Qur'an does not come wrapped in the language of domination or blind obedience, it comes wrapped in clarity, mercy, challenge, and an invitation to return to the self you were before the world told you who to be, before shame shaped your prayers, before fear dictated your silence. When you begin to speak to yourself with the voice of truth, and not the noise of history, or politics, or cultural bias, everything changes. The Qur'an dismantles the false narratives, not only about it, but about you. When I speak to myself this way, with the language of mercy, with the rhythm of remembrance, with the grounding of divine clarity, I don't become someone new. I remember who I was meant to be. I remember that worth is not earned by pain or perfection. I remember that knowledge is not something to fear, but to liberate. I remember that clarity isn't chaos, it's freedom, and I remember that the voice within me can sound like God's mercy if I let it, and that is why they fear it, not because of what the Qur'an might do to the world, but because of what it will awaken in you.